Hi, everyone. This is going to be the lecture video for the Enlightenment. I'm probably going to film this in two parts, one part over what the Enlightenment is, and a second part over the different enlightened thinkers. So let's get started. You do have a note paper that you can fill in as we go through. So we're starting off with some vocab practice. This is because you will be having a vocab quiz soon. At the time that I'm filming this, the vocab quiz is going to be Monday. We have a Bellwork paragraph. You can pause the video here and fill in the words, and then I'll pop up the words in a moment. Okay, so here are the answers to the vocab paragraph. We have from 1450 to 1750, the beginnings of capitalism. There we go. Capitalism could be seen through the success of the English and Dutch joint stock companies that made great profits from trading overseas. Within Europe, entrepreneurs supported cottage industries by paying rural households to process raw materials into finished products. We used the term proto-industrialization in our last vocab unit to describe like this concept. In the 1700s, these entrepreneurs devised ways to increase their profits even further by establishing the factory system to house newly innovated machines that would make production time even faster. Inventions like the power loom revolutionized the production of textiles, and interchangeable parts allowed for skilled or unskilled workers to quickly add product components along an assembly line. In time, though, the unskilled workers felt oppressed as they received low wages to perform in poor conditions, so they slowly formed labor unions to organize and petition for better rights. Some radical thinkers argue that the factory owners could not be trusted to hear the workers' rights or increase their pay, and that the proletariat themselves needed to violently seize control of the means of production. Under this new system of communism, the workers believed that they could finally live in a classless state and no longer suffer. So you can check your words. I know that we're going to do another vocab practice tomorrow before the American Revolution, and quiz will be Monday. Okay, so let's get started with our notes now. We're beginning with the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment kind of starts as a result of other movements that took place before it. This would kind of be like our contextualization or that like background information. We've previously talked about the Renaissance happening in Europe and exposing Europeans to classical thought from ancient Greece and Rome, and starting to think a little bit more about the individuals and humanism, having a little more secular thinking, which means a little bit less focused on the church and starting to see the value of humans rather than just like blindly following what a priest says. That kind of later sets us up for the scientific revolution, which we covered in Unit 3, where scientific thinkers are starting to use observation and math to make conclusions about the world around them, things that they can prove, and belief in these natural laws that govern the universe, including like the law of gravity and inertia. And those ideas about the Copernican or the heliocentric universe and ideas about the laws of physics, that ends up challenging the Catholic Church and the existing political structures like an absolute monarch, because the idea of the sun-centered universe goes against the earth-centered universe idea that the Catholic Church had been promoting. So a lot of these scientific revolution thinkers are publishing their findings that inadvertently challenge the church and the absolute monarch. And that kind of helps to usher in the Enlightenment, which is our intellectual movement in the modern era, 1750 to 1900. And during the Enlightenment, European thinkers are going to start to use scientific principles to try to solve their problems. They're going to use logic and reason and observation to try to fix any problems in society. So like kind of like how Newton was trying to come up with a way to explain like why we stay on the ground, why we don't float up into space. These like enlightened thinkers are trying to find a natural reason to explain like why there's an absolute monarch and why maybe the absolute monarch shouldn't be in power, why regular people should maybe be able to have a say in their government too. So the Age of Enlightenment is all about this intellectual movement where people are trying to use reason and logic and observation to try to fix their problems, to try to like change the political system. And this movement results in the rejection of absolutism and the promotion of political revolutions to ensure popular sovereignty and freedom and equality. Remember, popular sovereignty is a vocab word. It means government power coming from the people. Okay, so here's some characteristics of the Enlightenment. We'll have educated European men. They start to use science as the base for understanding and explaining things. And remember, at this time, the science that they're using is using like observation and math. And maybe like for the Enlightenment, to some degree, reasoning through things. They believe that reason and logic should be applied to solve society's problems. And the people who are engaging with the Enlightenment are called philosophes, which is the French word for philosopher. They're thinkers that tend to be very liberal in their thinking. They tend to want change. They tend to agree with a lot of the scientific revolution ideas. So they back Newton's theories on gravity and inertia. They would believe in the heliocentric or sun-centered universe. They're also going to believe in free speech. They don't want to be censored for the things they say. Because if we think back to the scientific revolution, the church did censor scientists. Remember, they put Galileo on trial, on the Inquisition trial, for publishing or for stating that he supported the sun-centered universe. I think we read an can't remember if we read a source with our contradiction documents on the scientific revolution where Copernicus actually wrote that he was scared of publishing his findings because he was scared of blowback from the church. So, like in the context of scientific thinkers being censored, many of the philosophes believe in free speech. They don't want to be censored for the things they say. They don't want to be punished for writing things that might go against the church or go against a monarch. They reject the divine right of the monarch and all the privileges that the nobles had. They think it's unfair that the nobles have special privileges. Many of the philosophes tend to be deists, and we'll go through what that means again. That was one of our vocab words. And like I said, they tend to be liberal in their thinking, meaning they want change in society. They would view change as progressive and beneficial. So as a recap, here's what deism means. Deists believe in God. They would believe in that Christian view that God created the universe. However, they don't think that God is intervening in people's daily lives. They think that God made the universe, but then God like took a step back and watched the universe and kind of let it move according to its own natural laws that could be found through science. They don't think that God is performing miracles. They don't think that God is going to send saints to the earth or like special people. They don't think that the Bible is like word for word exact, I guess. They would believe that because the Bible was written by men, there could be things that were maybe inaccurate in there. So they're not going to support like selling indulgences. They would view the Bible more as an important historical source, kind of the way that we look at our primary source documents. They wouldn't necessarily view the Bible as like an inspired document that's supposed to be a guide for your life. So, again, the deists believe that there is a God, but they don't think that God is as active in people's lives as the Catholic Church says that it is. So they would not support like a Cardinal Richelieu working in the government. They would not want a monarch to be claiming divine right to rule and saying that God has given him all the power. And because so many of the American founding fathers were deists, such as Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, that kind of contributed to America being founded as a state, or excuse me, as a nation, where there's supposed to be a separation of church and state, where the government is not supposed to like actively promote a religion, and where the government is not supposed to infringe on your ability to practice your religion. Because if we think about like Spain, for example, in the Spanish Inquisition, you weren't allowed to be Protestant or Jewish or Muslim. And deists would say like it's not the government's role to determine what religion you should be able to follow. So that's kind of like one way that the deists influence the American government once the American Revolution happens. Deists also use the analogy of God as a watchmaker. So again, like they believe that God made the universe. So like a watchmaker makes a watch. But then once the watch is made, you don't need the watchmaker to like keep adjusting it. The watch just moves on its own. That those hands just keep ticking around. Um, so like once God made the earth is made, God takes a step back. You don't need the watchmaker like intervening in the earth or doing things. So again, they wouldn't believe that God is intervening into human affairs, would not believe in miracles. Um, they would not want to see that like religious activity in the government. Okay, and then to recap liberal and conservative, because these were two of our vocab words, liberals view change as progressive and beneficial. They want society to change. They think that change is going to improve life. So liberals during the Enlightenment are going to condemn or reject the absolute monarch. They want to get rid of the absolute monarch and have more of a constitutional state, and they would resent all the privileges given to the nobles in the Catholic Church. For example, we're going to see that in France, the nobles didn't have to pay taxes, and the Catholic Church did not have to pay taxes either. Taxes were only paid by like the lower classes, which they perceived to be unfair. So the liberals would want that to change, and make sure that people were treated the same, like that all three levels, the church, the nobles, the people, they were all like paying the same amount of taxes. They typically favor a Republican form of government where citizens elect representatives and have a constitution that guarantees freedom and equality. I do want to point out, okay, it says typically favor republicanism with a little r. Republicanism is a government principle. That means people vote for their leaders. This is not capital R Republican, which is a political party in the United States. These are two separate things. Little r Republicanism means it's just a concept that means that people vote for their leaders, whereas capital R Republican is an American political party. Again, they're like two separate things, kind of like, I don't know, there's an apple that you eat. That's a fruit, right? That's different than the company Apple. They have the same name, but they're like two different things. So Republicanism and the Republican Party in the United States are two separate things, completely separate. So liberals want to have a government where people get to vote for their leaders and government based on popular sovereignty. And they want to have a constitution that gives freedom and equality to people. But there's kind of a caveat here. I know I have a caveat somewhere. There we go. The caveat is that when they say that they want freedom and equality, they tend to mean that they only want it for educated white men. They don't always want it for women or people of color or poor people. And I might have talked about this in vocab yesterday, but we can prove this by saying that in the United States, the American Revolution was very much influenced by the Enlightenment. And when the United States became an independent country, women were not given equal rights or the right to vote or the ability to, like, I don't know, open a bank account for many, many, many years, like decades and even centuries in some cases. So women did not have equal rights when America was founded. Same for people of color. Slavery was not abolished when the United States was founded. It took decades for people of color to get the right to vote, to get citizenship, and even then, there were limits on that. And same with poor people. People don't really consider that part either. Poor white men could not vote when our country was founded. It took, I think, like 50 years-ish for poor white men who did not own land to even be able to vote in an election. So when we say like freedom and equality, there's usually a caveat because liberalism is really not going so far as to support equality like for all people. There are some limits on it at first. But But eventually, we'll see that like women, people of color, poor people, they start reading about the Enlightenment, using those ideas to say actually rights should be extended to us too, which is where we get into the abolitionist movement, which was one of our vocab words, and eventually like women's suffrage movements as well. Okay, conservatives, on the other hand, think that society needs to stay the same. Either we maintain the status quo, which means things should stay the way that they are, or that we should resist change or maybe go back to like the traditions of the past. Or in some cases, if change will happen, it should happen like super, super slowly over a really long period of time. So things like traditional values are typically associated with conservatism. And in this time period, conservatives will reject quick change, like what we see in the French Revolution, which we'll talk about on Monday. They tend to be the monarchs, the nobles, and the Catholic Church. They tend to be more conservative in this time period because all three groups benefit from things staying the way that they are. The monarchs in a position of power. Nobles get special privileges, like in France, they don't pay taxes, they get to live luxurious lives. And the Catholic Church, we've talked about at length, has so much political power and money. So those would be the conservative groups in society. They want things to stay the way that they are. They would not always support enlightened ideas. Okay. And here's a list of some ideas that enlightened thinkers would support. We've said some of these already. They support popular sovereignty, or the idea that power comes from the people, not from the divine right of the absolute monarch. And they would want to get rid of an absolute monarch in favor of having a constitutional government where there's limits on what the leader can and cannot do. Like you might remember from our last unit that England became a constitutional state. They still have a monarch, but there's limits on what the monarch can do. So hopefully you recall that. That would be something that would be consistent with an enlightened idea. An enlightened thinker would support that. They also support little r republicanism, which is the idea that we vote to elect our leaders. Remember, this is not capital R Republican Party. These are two separate things. This is the little r republicanism concept, which means that we vote for our leaders. We show our power, like we show our power by voting for our leaders. So it's almost like a subset of popular sovereignty. They would care about free press and free speech. And again, this is because during the scientific revolution, so many thinkers were censored or put on the Inquisition for writing things that were counter to the Catholic Church. And we'll see that many enlightened thinkers do actually get imprisoned for the things that they say, things that would, attack the church or a monarch. They support social and political equality, but we're going to define this as an end to privileges for the nobles. And again, this is the like educated white men. They want to be on the same level as the nobles. They want to have some say in their government. They don't necessarily want equality for women. They don't necessarily want equality for people of color, and they don't necessarily want equality for the poor. And again, we could give those examples in the United States. Women, people of color, the poor cannot vote in the United States at its founding and for at least its first 50 years. Darn it, there was something else I was going to say about that I've forgotten. Eventually, though, we want to remember that women, people of color, they do start to read enlightened ideas and say, oh, like these things should apply to women. They should apply to people of color. There shouldn't be slavery. And that's going to end up contributing to the abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movement down the line. And it's also going to be prominent in the Haitian Revolution, which we'll cover next week because the Haitian Revolution starts as a slave revolt. And it is the only successful slave revolt that helps to topple slavery and establish a state in Haiti where there is no slavery and there's no hierarchy attached to that. Oh, I was going to say that there are occasionally some enlightened thinkers that do support some rights for women or abolitionism, but the vast majority of enlightened thinkers kind of initially do not. They just want an equal playing field for themselves. Enlightened thinkers tend to support laissez-faire economics. Remember, that's the hands-off approach, the idea that the government needs to keep its hands off of the economy. This was a liberal idea at the time. Nowadays, it's a little more conservative, but at the time, this was a new revolutionary idea. They also support having checks and balances and separation of powers. Remember that under separation of powers, there's three separate branches, each with its own tasks. Whereas checks and balances is the ability of one branch to limit the power of another. This would prevent an abuse of power and having like one monarch trying to override or supersede the power of like a parliament or the judges or something like that. Okay. And they also support individual freedom, which means that regular people have rights. They would want the people to be able to have trial by jury. They would want the people to be able to have lawyers if they have to go to court. They would want the people to have like free press, free speech, right to assemble, the things that are guaranteed by a Bill of Rights. It's a freedoms reserved for individual people. So like, again, like our Bill of Rights, free speech, free press, no quartering soldiers, right to bear arms, um, no cruel and unusual punishment. That's what individual freedom means, that regular people get to have rights too. Okay, so I think this is where I'm going to stop in this video. I'm going to do a new video for the different enlightened thinkers.